Welcome back to the On Adventure podcast. I'm Josh Self, and I'll be your host. This episode is the second installment in a series of conversations I've wanted to do for a while. Conversations that live right at the intersection of adventure and spirituality. We're exploring what happens when we choose hard things and when we step into uncertainty, and when we find ourselves pushed to the edge of what we thought we were capable of, and how those moments often become the places where something deeper wakes up inside of us. Today's conversation isn't necessarily about summiting mountains or chasing adrenaline, though there's plenty of adventure here. It's about what it looks like to risk change in midlife, and to walk away from what's familiar, and to wrestle honestly with identity, purpose, and even faith when the old answers stop working. My guest today is my friend Scott Sauls. Scott has spent a decade leading, teaching, and shaping others, and in this conversation we talk about what it means to face burnout and confront the stories we tell ourselves about success, and then to discover that some of the most meaningful adventures happen internally, often through suffering, community, and surrender. If you've ever felt the pull towards something more but weren't sure what it would cost, this conversation's for you. Let's get into it. All right, Scott Sauls, welcome to the On Adventure podcast. I've known each other for a couple years now, and I think this is going to be fun. I'm going to be just kind of sit back and let you do your thing in this conversation, and I appreciate you joining me to do this. And as anybody that's listened to the last episode, this is part of really a series I wanted to do around the holidays of exploring where the pursuit of hard things and challenges and even suffering at times can be an overlap for the pursuit of spirituality and connecting with our higher power that some of us call God, and what that looks like in different contexts. So I think with your background and our friendship over the last several years, I think this will be a great conversation. You're the perfect guy to have on here, so I appreciate you joining me.
It's great being with you, Josh. Looking forward to the conversation.
All right. Well, for anyone that doesn't know who Scott Sauls is, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Married to Patty. We've been married over 30 years, and we have two adult daughters, Abby and Ellie, who are married respectively to Jeffrey and Drew. And we have been in Nashville, Tennessee now for about 13 and a half years. We came here by way of New York City, where I served at a church called Redeemer Presbyterian. And prior to that, we'd spent about 11, 12 more years starting new churches and leading those churches. But my wife and I met way back when I was in grad school and she was in grad school, and we met in a church community that we were both part of, and have been in life together ever since. And so a couple of years ago, just professionally, I pivoted out of the profession of leading churches as a senior pastor, which I'd done in various contexts for about 30 years, into what I now do regularly, which is pour into and support, I guess what you could call high achieving, high capacity leaders and cultural influencers. And most of that work is done with leaders and influencers in the greater Nashville area, what some call Middle Tennessee, which encompasses Davidson and Williamson County. And that's been incredibly rewarding. Been doing that for about 2 years now, and have no plans to stop. But that's been my big adventure, is making a career pivot in my mid-50s into an entrepreneurial endeavor that had been in my heart for a lot of years, but I had just had a lot of fear about change and newness, and adventuring into territory that wasn't as familiar to me as pastoring churches was. And so far so good, still learning, having a great time, and getting to enjoy wonderful things like your friendship, Josh.
Well, I appreciate that. Where did you grow up?
I grew up all over the place. I was born in Silver Springs, Maryland, and from that point forward, we lived in several different places, each stop for about 2 years. My dad worked for a company called IBM, which we who were in the system, called it I've Been Moved. IBM, their promotion structure almost always included a move or a relocation to another city. And so downside is I don't have any childhood friendships that I can say are still meaningful connections in my life, because there was never really the time or the length of season to develop that. But on the positive side, I've lived in a lot of places, seen a lot of places, and both my wife and I now are putting our roots down here in Nashville, where both of us have lived longer now than either of us had ever lived anywhere else. And so I've lived in Salt Lake City, Utah. I've lived in Omaha, Nebraska. I've lived in Mahwah, New Jersey, which is a suburb outside of New York City. And then in our adult life, we've lived in Kansas City, St. Louis, New York City, and Nashville. And I'm probably leaving out a couple of places in there too.
So that the way you describe, I didn't realize our growing up years overlapped in that way, because I moved about every 2 or 3 years as well. There's one or two guys that I remember that I've somewhat stayed in touch with from childhood, mostly high school, like towards the very, very end. And so sometimes I struggle looking back on that and thinking of it in positive terms. It's very easy to look back on that and go, man, here's the list of ways that screwed me up. Is that easy for you to do, to look back in the way you framed it as both the negative and the positive, or is that something that's taken a little bit of time?
Yeah, I think I was cynical about moving all over the place for a lot of years. And then I think just the older I've gotten and the more retrospect you get on your life, the more you realize, hey, there was some valuable stuff, some life-giving things that occurred along the way that wouldn't have otherwise occurred. And so, it's probably a net positive, I would say. But, we've also, my wife and I, come to really value building long-term friendships and putting down roots. We just got started a little bit later in life than most people due to our circumstances. One place that I forgot to mention where I lived was Greenville, South Carolina, where I spent my 4 years of college at Furman University. And it was there that I met some of my very first lifetime friends. And, one of the communities that you and I are part of, Josh, overlaps with a handful of those people that I went to college with, which is great. But I was kind of a late bloomer building lifetime friendships, which started in the college years as well.
So you've been in Nashville a long time, or longer than these other places. Has that been uncomfortable at any point with it being so different than the other places that you've lived, or have you settled into it pretty easily?
Nashville? Nashville is a kind of a fascinating place because in one sense, you can find, very much a Bible Belt vibe, here, which this is going to sound maybe strange to some coming from a guy who's been a pastor for over 30 years, but I don't like the Bible Belt vibe. There's a lot that I don't like about it. But Nashville is also an incredibly industrious, diverse, and fascinating place with arts and entertainment, entrepreneurism, major universities, et cetera. And we kind of came here kicking and screaming because we grew to love our home in New York City. And that really felt like, this is really us. We're kind of urban center people and, love the diversity and the pace and the culture making dynamics of living in a global city, et cetera. And when it became clear that our next stop was going to be Nashville, it felt a little bit like a death. And part of that, Josh, was because we didn't realize, how wide and deep the cultural riches are here and how significant the diversity is. I think the last statistic I read, Nashville is the 5th most internationally and culturally and ethnically diverse city in America per capita. But the reason why it doesn't seem that way to you and me or to most people, Josh, is because it's also one of the most segregated cities from zip code to zip code in America, which I think is kind of there's a hangover effect from the civil rights era that is still sadly in many ways with us here in this town. And so there's some brokenness here that needs to be addressed as well. And so a lot of good and some challenges here, which I guess is true of any time in any season in any city.
Yeah. So you've been in this area for a while. You came here to really take over and correct me if I'm wrong here, but a large church at the time, as the lead pastor, became an even larger church with even more of a reach while you were there. And then a couple years ago, this transition really was kind of forced on you. And I'm not going to ask you to say anything you don't want to or talk about any of the details, but I think if you could give a little bit of color around that transition, that would be
Hmm.
helpful as we talk about how adventure can look different for different people.
Yeah, so a lot to that story, but the shorter version of it is I had about 12 really wonderful, or 11 really wonderful, life-giving, moving from strength to strength to strength years serving in this particular context in the local church. And then my last 6 months, were very difficult for a lot of reasons. Some of it circumstances and situations and systems beyond my control, and some of it, very much, the baggage that I was carrying and had been carrying for a lot of years, even decades of my life, that I'd never really dealt with, and it just sort of came out in a season of stress and push come to shove. I didn't get fired. The church didn't ask me to leave, but I submitted my resignation after a certain period of time. My wife and I realized it was just time for a change, time for a fresh start. But we didn't know what that fresh start was going to be. We just knew that continuing where we were in the context where we were would not give us enough breathing room to deal with some of the things that particularly I needed to deal with within myself. And that led to a month away at a center that specializes in recovery, and a lot of leaders are recommended there to do recovery work. And it's not necessarily substance addiction, but I had what more could what people would call maybe a process addiction, where I've just had reached a point where I felt that my identity and personhood was inseparable from my work and from my productivity. And I didn't realize, until that time where we realized, it was the right time to step away. I didn't realize how inhumane of a pace I was subjecting myself to. I was pastoring a 3,500 person megachurch with an 85 person staff. And I was traveling the country about 3 times a month to do speaking engagements and keynote talks and, consulting with other leaders, et cetera. I published 6 books, Josh, in 5 years, which is absolutely absurd. It's just an insane pace. And
Not so much absurd if that was the only thing you were doing,
if it was
right?
the only thing I was doing, I could write a book a year if I was a career author and nothing else. But I was pastoring a large church that took probably 60 hours a week of my time, and plus the travel all over it was I was not sleeping well. I developed chronic insomnia. My cortisol levels were completely jacked up. And for about 5 years, I had life and leadership coaches, as well as the counselor. And I don't think he'd mind me mentioning his name. His name is Chip Dodd. He works out of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and just specializes with helping leaders recover their hearts. And he was urging me for a period of about 4 to 5 years to step away, for my sake and everybody's
Hmm.
sake, and start working with leaders and start zeroing in on a smaller, more specialized group of people, because he believed that's what I was called to. And I don't know, I think there was a fear of not wanting to kind of, jump out of the boat and try to walk on the water of unfamiliar territory, so to speak. And again, when you've been doing the same thing for 30 years, it's hard to imagine, in the later years of midlife, to pivot to something brand new. But, so in a sense, my own anxiety, was sort of the last straw, or the final trigger that led me to heed the advice that was being given to me by people who were speaking into my life for several years at that point. And so we finally, made the switch. And looking back, we could see God's hands all over it, and feel like we're living a lot more healthy existence now than we have in a long, long time.
There's a saying I go to on the financial planning side, my day job, that money rarely solves problems. It will to some extent, but it's a really good exposer of the problems that were already there. So kind of the jelly donut theory of you don't know what's on the inside until you put pressure on it, and then it comes squirting out in all different directions that you can't control. And money, and especially money in excess, will do that for sure. I see it over and over again. But in the context of what you're describing, it was a different kind of pressure that it sounds like was coming at you. Some of it self-imposed over and over again until the jelly came out in all directions that, you couldn't control at that point. What do you think you were trying to solve with beating yourself with that kind of routine and schedule?
Oh man, dad issues. I had a very complicated relationship with my father, and my father was a very complicated man. And he's now deceased, and I have a lot more compassion for the demons that he carried and that he brought into our family, knowing that he probably, in the quietness of his own heart, wished that he didn't bring those demons into our family. But yeah, I think a lot of it was just, the effort that happens oftentimes, especially with men who have not resolved their childhood wounds, will run to things like success and achievement and reputation and having something to show for your work as a validation that you feel like you never got when you were a kid or what have you. So really it was just, I think, this relentless chase to prove something to the universe, even though the universe felt very impersonal, and there's this obscure Woody Allen film called Zelig that nobody's ever seen, but he plays this character who's just constantly blending into whatever he feels like people's expectations are of him in whatever environment he's in. And one time he's in a therapist's office, and the therapist asks him, why do you turn into such a chameleon? With every environment you enter, you're a different person. And his answer was, safe. I want to be liked. I want to be safe. I want to feel safe, and I want to be liked. And I think that's a demon that a lot of successful professional people carry into their work, and it lands a lot of us in counseling somewhere in our 50s, or thereabouts, or somewhere around midlife when we realize, wait a minute, all this success is not delivering emotionally and personally and spiritually and relationally all the things that it promised that it would deliver. And here I am still struggling with the same internal issues that I was as I did when I was 6, 7, 8, 9, 12, 15 years old. People in the world of therapy and the 12 steps and recovery talk about the inner child. And I used to kind of poo-poo at that. Oh, your inner child, blah, 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 blah. But I think there's something really, really powerful to that insight that in many ways, we are still the 12-year-old. We're still contending with whoever we were internally as a 12-year-old, carrying that into adulthood. And that's certainly true of my story. And that's certainly true about what drove me to become a work addict. And so
I appreciate you going into that much detail. There's a lot that I resonate with that. Certainly a long season for me where I would describe it as the hustle for worthiness. Nobody's going to outwork me. Nobody's going to work harder. And even the chameleon thing, like I said earlier, connecting with you on the moving part growing up, I got to college and realized I could be anybody in any room. And it didn't matter. The problem was I was never me. I was always
Mm-hmm.
somebody else in order to fit in. And fitting in, Brene Brown says, fitting in is not connecting. It's not the same thing. But I was really, really good at fitting in. And so, yeah, you get to your midlife and you go, I don't want to fit anymore. I want connection.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what
That's right.
matters. And so bringing that back to adventure, and I was telling you this before we started recording, one of my previous guests, Matt Walker, talked about the 5 elements of a true adventure. And the fifth and completing element of that is community. It's connecting with
Mm-hmm.
others while you're
Yeah.
doing the hard thing that you're doing. And as a, a very committed introvert, that is difficult at times to do, but when I've done it
Yeah.
at different points in my life, it adds the color to the canvas way
Yeah.
better than any other hard thing. So I think there were a couple other things that came up while you were saying that, and I've already lost them to my mind. But what I want to do with that background is talk a little bit about where you have found really what adventure means to you. So as
Mm-hmm.
someone that has spent years and years and hours really in running a business. Now that some people
Mm-hmm.
may spear me for calling a church a business, but especially when it gets very large, it looks very similar to a business.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes a lot of the same energy and skills that you would have in a private business. So you've spent a lot of your life, committed a lot of your life to do that, to make this major shift into something unknown. So in this stage of life, what does adventure mean to you? How would you describe that for where you're at?
Man, I mean, I'm not sure how prepared I am for, giving a meaningful answer to the question. And so I'll just riff a few words that I associate with adventure at this stage of life. Curiosity is part of adventure for me. Pursuing curiosity, regardless of where it leads, is part of adventure. Being willing to lose, being willing to take risks, being willing to have my mind changed, being willing to be persuaded and persuadable by people that whose ideas may sound strange or foreign or unusual or new to me. Adventure really boils down to not staying stuck. And that can take a lot of different forms, how we can get stuck, Josh. But I always want to be growing and developing and pursuing a better and more life-giving version of what I could be and who I could be. And so with that, to your point, adventure, I think the best adventure always involves community. I mean, you look at some of the best adventure stories like, Lord of the Rings or, Braveheart or what have you, the heroes are always surrounded by people, and the villains always seem to be
By
isolated.
themselves, by
You know what I
themselves.
mean? And there, I think there's really something to that, and so just and people talk about community and like they say, well, I'm in midlife, I don't have any friends, it's so hard to make friends, it's so hard to, where do I even begin, blah blah blah. And I think that's actually very true. But at the same time, I think it helps people to understand that all you really need to flourish as a human in community is one close friend. You just need one. And when I say close friend, I mean somebody who's not in your immediate family. It's ideal to have one close friendship or growing friendship. And if you can have two or three, great. I don't think most of us have capacity for more than maybe 5 or 6 close friendships. And so the whole image of, I can't be a whole human being until I have 100, close friends. Well, no, I think that spreads it too thin. It only takes a few. Even Jesus, he had his 3, but he also had his 1. I sort of feel like John was probably his tightest friend, and then he had his 3 closest, and then he had the 12, and then he had the 72, and then he had the crowds. But the ones he really poured into and was vulnerable and did self-disclosure with was that kind of inner core. And There's this writer that I really admire named C.S. Lewis, who's written a lot about friendship and love and community and life together. And, he just boils it down to, everybody needs friends. And that you found a friend when one person looks at another and says, "What? You too? I thought I was the only one." And, I think there's so many isolated, especially middle-aged men who walk around the world feeling like they're the only one. And, nobody's going to get me. Nobody's going to understand. People are going to judge me if I share what I'm feeling, etc. And then we take the risk and we put it out on the table of, hey, I struggle with imposter syndrome, and here are 3 reasons why. Or even though I have a robust, savings account or investment portfolio in your world of finance, Josh, I still feel very insecure and afraid about money. And I don't know what it is. And as soon as one person goes first and just puts those kind of anxious fears on the table, all of a sudden you have a real conversation. Because somebody, leans in and says, "Wait, you too? I thought I was the only one, except my thing isn't money, it's my marriage, or my thing isn't my marriage, it's my body type, or the list is as long as there are people." But I think adventure, getting back to the subject, involves and really requires self-disclosure, relational risk-taking, and I'm not talking about being reckless and just, spilling your laundry out and bleeding out sideways to everybody you meet. But if you find somebody that you've got a pretty reasonable hunch that you can trust them, take the risk and share something that you wouldn't usually share about what your hopes are, about what you're dreaming about, or about what you're afraid of, and see where the conversation goes. But that's where real connection. I love how you use that word connection, which is very different than just being in the same room together or having a shared goal is not necessarily connection. Connection is that which draws out the humanity and the depth that's in every human being in the equation. So
the really scary part of that is once you release that personal information to someone else, I have no control over that, of what they do with it. Right.
That's right.
They could use it against me. They could ignore it, which might even be worse. Or they might just use it to be kind and engaging in a way that deepens the friendship. But, this is something that took me a very long time to learn, but it's a very scary process, but one that sometimes is very rewarding. Not always, but sometimes.
Well, I think the people in the recovery world have a lot of wisdom to pass on to the rest of the world. The healing rate in the world of recovery is significant. You don't have to have a professional therapist in the room or a professional clergy person for healing to happen. But what you do have to have is transparency. And what you do have to have is a shared commitment to what people in the recovery world call the serenity prayer, which starts, "God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change," which essentially means I relinquish the illusion of control. And then give me the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And of course, others would personalize it and say, grant me the serenity to accept the people that I cannot change, the courage to change the one person that I can change, and the wisdom to know that person is me. Control, the illusion of control and the obsession with control and the addiction to control, which I believe drives all addiction. Any form of addiction traces back to an addiction to control. And trying to control things, trying to control life, as opposed to just doing wise planning and then taking life on its own terms, I think is a significant and important part of the path to freedom. But that means being open-handed with control, which is really, really hard for controlling people like yours truly.
Very scary as well. And so that kind of gets us to a point where one question I wanted to ask you was, when we find ourselves kind of at the end of a rope, maybe it's a literal rope out in the wilderness, climbing a mountain. You're talking in context of not necessarily outdoors, but just living life in general. What is it about getting to the end of that rope, which many times includes suffering and hardship, for that to be the time where we, whether it's interest in spiritual things raises to the top of the service, or for some people, they describe it as a real communing with God in those moments. Again, sometimes at the top of a mountain, or I've interviewed people that literally have been to the top of Everest or jumping out of airplanes. But in any context, why is it, in your opinion, that it takes that kind of to the end of ourself before spiritual things become really illuminated?
Okay, so for your religious listeners, I'm going to ask your religious listeners to allow me to put on my preacher's hat, and for your non-religious listeners, I'm going to ask them to allow me to put on my philosopher's hat. And I'll try to speak with both hats on, with one simple message that I think is intuitively obvious to anyone who's lived any amount of real life with their eyes open. For life to happen in any way, shape, or form, death has to happen first. For glory to happen, suffering has to come first. For triumph and victory to happen, some form or series of losses has to come before it, for it to have any sort of meaning. I mean, even just think about the food we eat. Think about the last meal that you had. I'll tell you what I had. I ate at Mojo's Taco over here at the Franklin factory right down the road from you, Josh. And I had a delicious meal of black beans. That was my side. And I had a couple of chicken fajitas. And in that chicken fajita was meat that came from a dead chicken, and grilled vegetables that came from dead vegetables, and a wrap that was created out of dead wheat, and beans that are now dead, taken off of a living plant. And I need all of that dead stuff in order for my life to be sustained. I can't, there's nothing I've ever put in my body that I know of, at a meal, at least after cooking it, that was alive. And that's a metaphor, I believe, for how the universe operates. That we have all these phrases, from dust to glory, the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat, and Jesus would frame it this way: unless a kernel of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it abides alone. But when it falls into the ground and dies, it bears much fruit. And he's trying to draw a connection between suffering and hardship and loss and glory. And I think what he means by glory is becoming better versions of ourselves, to sort of expand the conversation for religious and irreligious people alike. We become better versions of ourselves when we allow ourselves to be in a position to lose, and to be in a position to suffer to a certain extent, and also allow us to learn whatever life lessons and truths that those experiences of hardship might want to teach us. Man, I tell you, some of the most deep, rich, wise, rich in spirit, wise, fully present people I know, Josh, are the people who've got suffering in their background. And I don't know a whole lot of people for whom, life has been just an easy walk in the park, who actually end up being people of deep substance, who actually have something to say. And, that's all anecdotal, of course, and maybe somebody can contradict that with an anecdote of their own. But just from my own experience, the deepest wells of a human being are the ones who've been through some stuff. And that's because I think that's how the whole universe is wired. The food that nourishes us is the food that has died first. And it plays out, a whole lot of different ways. But I hope that's not too sort of ethereal or philosophical or lofty. But
no, that's exactly what I was hoping from you. I think again, this is totally anecdotal, but when as much of an introvert as I am, I'm also a very high skeptic for
Mm-hmm.
anything that is said. And
Mm-hmm.
so if somebody says something or makes a claim or it talks in big flowery terms, my first thought, I may not say this out loud, but my first thought is, how do you know?
Mm-hmm.
And unless there is an experience that they have gone through that proves out what they just said, I'm probably going to discount it. I've never
Mm-hmm.
really
Yeah.
intentionally thought about that, but I think I do that.
Yeah.
To your point, that it's the people that have
Yeah.
drugged themselves through the hard time or have made it through and learned from that, that they have something worthwhile to speak about.
Yeah.
And I want to listen to folks like that. So it overlay that in the world of outdoor pursuits. So
Mm-hmm.
around guys that run 100-mile races or more.
Mm-hmm.
One of my most recent guests did a 500K race from Kentucky to Georgia.
Wow.
There are people
Wow.
that do this over and over
Yeah.
and over again.
Yeah.
And I like to say, as a species, we don't do anything unless there's truly a reward.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we would do something repeatedly unless we're getting something out of that.
Yeah.
So use what you just said as kind of the backdrop to riff off of that idea as well.
Mm-hmm.
Of For these outdoor pursuits or any kind of pursuit where it's known to be suffering is almost guaranteed,
Mm.
hardship is almost guaranteed. And sometimes death may be a reality,
Yeah.
for some of these things that people do. What are they getting out of that? What do you see from a spiritual standpoint that would be the carrot that continues to bring people back? I've got a
Yeah.
list of things that people have said to me that
Mm-hmm.
brings them back, but from a spiritual standpoint, what do you think it is?
So I'm sure you've seen the documentary called Free Solo,
Mhm.
where the
Alex Honnold,
guy, yeah, he climbs, what is it, El Capitan,
he's getting
at
ready to do the same
Yosemite.
thing, climbing up a building on live TV.
I've heard that, and we cringe at the thought, and yet we're the first. I've watched it probably 3 times because of something that it draws out of me. You asked me to connect it to the spiritual, and I'll speak from my own viewpoint and experience there, and that is that all the way back from the beginning, the Bible says in the very beginning, in the earliest chapters in the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible, that God has created human beings in his own image, which means that in our hearts and in our dreams, for all that life could be, we have infinite capacity. And the frustrating part of that is we're stuck, at least right now, we're stuck in a finite shell that we call our bodies. We're limited by time, we're limited by space, we're limited by, illness, we're limited by, aging and all the rest. And yet our spirits have unlimited capacity to dream. And that's why we have fairy tales. That's why we have stories in which, children can fly and in which people can leap tall buildings in a single bound, and who are more powerful than a locomotive, etc. That's why we have superheroes, because there's something in us. We create the superhero stories and the miracle stories of kids flying and so on, not because there's something wrong with us, but because there's something right with us, not because we're out of touch, but because we are in touch with how we as human beings have been created and designed. And that is for greatness and glory. And so, the hunger and thirst for adventure, the hunger and thirst to climb mountains that only few people have climbed and survive it. You hear the Mount Everest stories and how many people die, trying to, make it to the top of Everest. And yet people still do it year after year after year after year, because we have this belief in us that is tied to how we were created, that we should be able to do it. And so, by golly, if somebody's going to try, why wouldn't it be me? I mean, my son-in-law right now is training for a marathon, right? He did a half marathon last year, and took everything out of him, but he's like, you know what? I did a half. I think I can do a full. And it's just in all of us. And the moment we stop dreaming about what potential there might be for something even bigger and something greater and something more, is the day that we maybe start, moving toward our own death, which is also inevitably going to come for all of us, right? And I imagine as a 72-year-old man, I'm going to be less capable of, hiking Mount LeConte in East Tennessee than I am now, or than I was in my 20s or 30s. But the thing is, the older we get, that desire for more never goes away. I mean, there's this book by Arthur Brooks called From Strength to Strength, and he talks about how kind of in midlife our ambitions, our capacity for ambition and our capacity to dream doesn't change. It just changes subject. When we're in our first, earlier 20 years of life and career, we're build. And then we realize, wait a minute, somewhere in midlife, our back starts to hurt, or we get a diagnosis or whatever, or we just feel more tired than we used to. And suddenly we realize, wait a minute, I've got this one life to live and it has a shelf life on it. And I'm starting to feel that. And then we transition to ambition for meaning, for things like truth and beauty and meaning. And so we're builders at the beginning, and then we become philosophers, toward the end, who can then pass wisdom on to the next generation to prepare them for when they hit, kind of that midstream mark, and so on. And the cycle goes, which is another thing about community. It's always great to be in community with people who are both older than you and younger than you. So you can be receiving wisdom and you can be passing on wisdom. That's a huge adventure, just the passing on of wisdom and life lessons from generation to generation.
So your group of high impact, high achieving men in Nashville is called the Sycamore Group, or Sycamore for short. Are you seeing some of this multi-generational transfer of wisdom happening within the group?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm in my second year, and this year I have somewhere between 30 and 40 leaders that I work with, and that was the same last year. I had about 30 or 40 that I work with in my first year group, and then I've got a second year group that I work with in a more concentrated and custom way. But particularly in the first year groups, there is this intergenerational thing, right? The target group is basically, professional men between their mid 30s and mid 50s is sort of the sweet spot. And so you get a few that are a little bit younger than their mid 30s and a few that are a little bit older than their mid 50s. And so you do get some of this organic intergenerational stuff happening. But what's really wonderful, and what I would encourage to anybody who, cares about continuing to learn and grow and develop for the rest of your life, is that the older guys are just as curious about what they can learn from the younger guys as the younger guys are what they can learn from the older guys. And that's a really beautiful thing, because what happens is a new generation comes along who sees things differently and who has, a different angle on the same truths and realities about life in this world that we live in. And so it's a cycle of reciprocal learning, if you allow it to be. We try to actually weed out people that we sense are going to want to be the expert in the room, because we want high capacity leaders who are obsessed about learning and growing and developing. And along the way, obviously, you're going to share your wisdom, but you're not going to be sharing it from the position of thinking, I'm the expert at the table. Humility is a key to true growth, and it's a great asset for any kind of adventure as well.
Yeah, something that came up for me while you were describing the body versus the soul, where, the soul being infinite, the body being finite, and yet we still, in so many different contexts, try to do things to push the infinite, to try to, what else is there to gain? One of the things that keeps coming up in these conversations over and over again about why do people do these things that are dangerous, guaranteed to be hard, I get pushback sometimes about whether it's truly suffering if you've
Mm.
chosen to do it. It's painful maybe.
Hmm.
Suffering might be a different tier there, but one of the things that keeps being said is I want to see where I measure up. Last time,
Mm.
like your son-in-law,
Hmm.
I did a half marathon, but
Hmm.
am I really somebody that can do a marathon? I think
Hmm.
so, but I
Hmm.
don't know until I try it. And he's going
Hmm.
to do the marathon, and he's going to go, well, could I do a 50K? I don't know. I did 26
No, I
miles.
think
Why
he's
couldn't I
gonna
do?
say I think if he does a marathon, he's gonna say, "I did a marathon."
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
probably gonna stop there.
Well, but I see it over and over again, Scott, where
Yeah.
people do these crazy things and for about 15 minutes talk about how stupid and painful it was, and then they're planning the next one.
Yeah.
And
Well,
it's a
it's
little
also part
bit
of their life. It's also part of their life story.
true.
Every dinner conversation they have, there's opportunity for them to be the most interesting person in the room because of that part of their story.
Maybe, but I mean, that's taken
Yeah.
a more of a self-focused, and I don't always find these
Yeah.
people,
Yeah.
the everyday explorers, to be like that.
Yeah.
And the way I've never really thought about it, like you described, of part of us is designed for the infinite, for the forever, for the things that are much bigger than our fragile bodies can do. But we want to. Some of us still find ways to
Mm.
stretch that. How close can we get to the infinite? So that definitely lines up in a lot of different contexts. And I think what you've described, you've done coming out of the church business and into the leader business, and being with these high impact guys, is very much that. I mean, there's probably an element of you toe the line to see, am I the kind of person that does this? Like, can I do this?
Mhm.
And you've described it. It's been a hard, painful at times transition to get into it. But so my question to you is whether it's this professional transition, or maybe think of other difficult times of your life. What do you, how do I want to ask this? What do you hear from God in those moments? What is it that you learn about yourself or about the way the universe exists in the moments of hardship?
So, there's this song by one of my favorite rock bands called Radiohead, and I think it's their best known song. It's called "Creep," and one of the lines is, "I want to be special. I wish I was special. So effing special. But I'm a creep. But I'm a creep. I'm a weirdo. What the hell am I doing here? I don't belong here." And I think the brilliance of that lyric, I think there's a lot of irony in there, but the best irony has a whole lot of truth beneath it
Hmm.
about the human experience. We all want to be so effing special because we're made to be that way, and we are. I mean, scripture itself, again, if you come from a religious perspective, the eighth psalm says that we human beings have been created a little bit less than God, and He has crowned us with glory and crowned us with honor, and yet, again, our finite limitations are what hold us back from being and becoming all that we really can be. But there are basically two paths to your question. We can either take that and go the path of cynicism and despair and quitting and just giving up, or we can go the path of, you know what, there is dignity in chasing after the crest of this mountain that I dream about scaling, even if I know there's only a 5% chance that I'm going to get there. There's dignity and honor and worth in chasing it. Like William Wallace, some would say William Wallace lost at the end of Braveheart, but he didn't lose because he chased after what he believed in his bones was right, whatever the cost to himself, whatever degree to which the odds were against him and against his loyal crew. You know, he won, and in many ways, you could say that the pinnacle of his victory was in the way that he went down. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He's like, bring it on. If it's my time, it's my time. Bring it on. But I'm not caving, not to you. And, the people who end up the winners in the war end up the losers in the story. You look at all the great stories and those frustrating moments where the villain, seems to get the last word and you realize, wait a minute, there's something more deep and transcendent and huge going on here than just this little moment. And you know, Jesus dying on the cross, in the Christian story, was one of those moments where, in the eyes of some, see, he's the loser that we always suspected he was, and then in the eyes of the others, this is the greatest triumph, for someone with his character and with his degree of power to be able to have the power of restraint to allow these characters to humiliate him in this way. What great restraint he has. And who has the power of restraint to let themselves be humiliated for the greater good, right? And so it really, so much of it is how we look at it and the lens through which we look at victory versus defeat. And I think if we're looking through healthy lenses, what many people regard as defeat is actually a victory, and what many people regard as a victory is actually defeat. And what it really boils down to is when you're 73 years old, alone in the bathroom, naked after your morning shower, and you're looking into the mirror, what do you see? And I think most of us can answer that question pretty easily. What kind of life we've built by just looking at ourselves naked in a mirror. And I don't mean to put images in your mind there, but I think you know what I'm talking about. Naked as a metaphor, exposed, honest. And so that's part of adventure too, is getting to the place where we can be fully honest with ourselves about ourselves. Ironically, in that we become, I believe, the best versions of ourselves.
Well, so maybe we'll wrap up with this question. And a lot of what you're talking about is transformation. The idea of becoming someone different than who we are today, someone that we were meant to be, someone that we can be. And I see that again a lot in these adventure conversations, is that most of the time people aren't doing them as vain, pointless pursuits. They're doing it to become. What's after that is really different for each person. But if adventure truly is about transformation, regardless of the canvas that it's being written on, what would you hope for people listening to this? What would you hope that they are becoming through this process?
Yeah. Well, I think it boils down to, it's great if you have listeners, Josh, who are at the top of their game, they're leading in their industry, they're crushing it on the basketball court or the football field. They're winning by all of the ways that we measure winning. I think that's wonderful. And keep winning in that way for as long as you can, making straight A's. If there's college students, making the dean's list again, keep going for it. Turn that half marathon into a marathon if you can. But what I would want to say to my younger self, I don't want to, I don't want to position myself as everyone's sage, but this is what I would say to my younger self, is pay a lot more attention to the kind of person you're becoming as opposed to winning, and make sure that the experience of winning contributes to your humility as opposed to contributing to your pride. And I mean pride there's a good kind of pride, and taking pride in a good hard day's work and a job well done, and being having a prideful heart. That's what I'm talking about here. And it's the victories, contributing to humility is a lot more complicated of a process than our losses contributing to it. But even so, our victories, if our victories can become a source of gratitude as opposed to, that we have actually been created to be able to do this and to be able to, scale that mountain or hike that trail or run that race to the degree that we have. We've actually been given the capacity and entrusted with the capacity to win in that way. That's a source of gratitude, of just recognizing that the life we have was given to us. If you're a religious person, you believe that your life was given to you by your creator. If you're not a religious person, you still have to, concede that your life was given to you by your mom and your dad, and a healthcare system that enabled you to be delivered and fed and raised, to get you to the point where you are today. Everything that we have and everything that we are was at some point given, and so none of us can take full credit for the lives that we've been given. And even the opportunities that we have had, that over 90% of the world doesn't have those opportunities to get educated and to have doors open for us in ways that they have, that most people don't have those opportunities. Again, just to recognize in every good thing in your life, how does it trace back to a gift being given to you? That's going to cultivate a humility that's going to make you the kind of person I think that you want to be. Because when it's all said and done, as I study, just human development and human nature, both from a religious perspective and just a common sense perspective, what you're going to care about most in your last years of life is not the things that you accomplished, but the kind of person that you became. I'll close with this, Josh, and you and I have had conversations about this before. How many funerals have you and I been to? I've been to probably 300 to 400 funerals in my life. I've never been to a funeral where the dominant emphasis in the eulogies that are given about the deceased had to do with what he or she accomplished in their lifetime. The accomplishments are more of a footnote. What's talked about is how they showed up in relationships, and kind of the highlight reel of the best relational moments, the best connectional moments, the best character moments. Those are the things that people care about at funerals, and those are the things we're going to care about our own lives when we reflect back on them someday. And so I guess I would say the biggest adventure is as fun as accomplishing stuff is, the biggest adventure is the kind of people that we're becoming.
I think it's a great way to end. Really what you're describing is, regardless of the path, that the becoming part leads us right back to love. I mean, really, that's what you described in these eulogies, is not, my resume. It's not my resume virtues. This is what we talk about. It's not my resume virtues. It's my eulogy virtues. And most eulogies are about the ways that we engage with humanity, whether it's our family or people around us. I have not been to 300 funerals. I've been to a few, and I do not want to go to one where I hear the resume. I mean, that to me would be really, really sad. That what a waste. Somebody that obviously accomplished so much, could have done so much more for humanity if it was led by love and not accomplishment. And so I love that, that regardless of the adventure, that the becoming, the transforming really should lead us right back to loving each other, loving ourselves better. That's part of the recovery speak of, I've got to start here before I can truly be loving towards those around me. And I love to think that all these hard things that people are doing and the things that I try to challenge myself with are really more about transforming into a better human being that can love better, not just do a thing and accomplish something better than we did the day before. So I'm glad you ended with that. That was that was great.
Well, and if you can do both, that's awesome. If you can do both, that's awesome.
There are definitely people that are cut from a different genetic cloth than I am, that go out and do these things to get fastest known times or to win races or break records. That won't be part of my eulogy.
Mhm.
I'm not really going to be able to do those kind of things. But again, all of us can lean into becoming a person that
Yeah.
loves better. And I think that's a great summary for where our spiritual connections can really grow as our adventure grows in our life as well.
Mhm.
So Scott, I
Sure.
appreciate this, man. You've got a unique take on this from your background and experiences, and I appreciate you being so honest
Mm.
with all of that.
Well, thanks for the conversation, Josh. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the On Adventure podcast. Be on the lookout for another episode dropping in a couple weeks. And be sure to go to our YouTube page and subscribe and follow us there, as well as on all the socials from Facebook to Instagram and LinkedIn. Until our next episode, I hope you stay safe and stay on adventure.